A palace guard stood frozen outside Princess Charlotte's bedroom door, hearing her terrified screams from inside. The door was locked. The key was missing. Every second counted, but breaking down a royal door without permission could end his career, maybe even land him in serious trouble. Yet the crying was getting louder, more desperate. He had just seconds to make a choice that would change everything. What he did next shocked everyone at Kensington Palace. And when they finally got inside, what they found made even the toughest guards go pale. This is the true story of the day. Normal protocol was shattered to save a princess. The morning of September 9th started like any other day at Kensington Palace. The sun was barely peeking through the heavy curtains of the historic building when the household staff began their carefully choreographed morning routine. Everything in the royal residence ran like clockwork, with each person knowing exactly what they needed to do and when they needed to do it. The palace had operated this way for generations, and nothing ever went wrong because nothing was ever left to chance. Princess Charlotte, who was just 3 years old at the time, had spent the previous evening playing in the palace gardens with her older brother George. The two royal children had been chasing butterflies and laughing in the late afternoon sunshine while their parents watched from a nearby bench. Kate Middleton, the Duchess of Cambridge, had smiled as she watched her daughter's pigtails bouncing while she ran through the perfectly manicured grass. Prince William had taken dozens of photos on his phone, trying to capture the pure joy on his children's faces. It had been a perfect family moment, the kind that made all the pressures of royal life seem worth it. After bath time and bedtime stories, Charlotte had been tucked into her bed around 7:30 in the evening. Her favorite stuffed animal, a worn pink bunny that she had named Beatrice, was nestled in her arms. Kate had kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered goodnight before quietly closing the bedroom door. The soft click of the lock was just another part of the nightly routine. The doors to the children's rooms were always locked from the outside for security reasons. It was a safety measure that had been in place for decades, designed to protect the young royals from any potential intruders during the vulnerable nighttime hours. The master key to Charlotte's room was kept in a secure location known only to senior staff members and the royal protection officers. This key was checked multiple times throughout each shift, with guards physically confirming its location every 2 hours. The system had worked flawlessly for years across multiple royal residences. There had never been a problem, never even a close call. The protocols were considered foolproof by everyone who worked within the palace walls. That particular morning, however, something was different. Senior guard Thomas Harrington had arrived for his 6 a.m. shift, feeling slightly uneasy, though he could not quite put his finger on why. He was a veteran of 15 years with the Royal Protection Unit, a man known for his calm demeanor and strict adherence to protocol. His colleagues often joked that Thomas could probably recite the entire security manual backward while standing on his head. He took his job seriously because he understood that the safety of the royal family was not just a duty, but a sacred trust. Thomas began his morning rounds at precisely 6:15, walking the familiar corridors with measured steps. His polished shoes made soft clicking sounds on the marble floors as he passed priceless paintings and ancient tapestries. Everything seemed normal. The night shift guards reported no incidents, no unusual sounds, nothing out of the ordinary. The palace was peaceful and quiet, exactly as it should be. Thomas checked the external doors, tested the alarm systems, and reviewed the security camera footage from the previous night. Everything was in perfect order, or so it seemed. At 7 a.m., the household staff began arriving for their morning duties. Maria Rodriguez, who had been working as a nanny for the Cambridge children for 2 years, came through the staff entrance with her usual bright smile. She was carrying a small bag containing some new picture books she had purchased for Charlotte over the weekend. Maria had a special bond with the young princess, who would often run to greet her with enthusiastic hugs. The nanny loved her job and considered herself incredibly lucky to be part of such an important household. Maria made her way toward the children's wing, planning to quietly prepare Charlotte's room before the princess woke up. She needed to lay out the clothes that had been selected for the day's activities and make sure the bathroom was properly stocked with fresh towels. As she approached Charlotte's door, she noticed something odd. There was a faint sound coming from inside the room, a whimpering noise that immediately set off alarm bells in her mind. She pressed her ear against the heavy wooden door and felt her heart skip a beat. Charlotte was crying, not the normal fussy sounds of a child just waking up, but genuine, distressed crying. Maria tried the door handle, but it was locked as expected. She knocked gently and called out in a soft voice, asking if Charlotte was okay. The crying only got louder in response, mixed now with calls from Mommy and Daddy. Something was very wrong, and Maria knew she needed to act fast. The nanny rushed down the corridor, her comfortable work shoes slapping against the floor as she moved faster than palace protocol normally allowed. She found Thomas Harrington near the main staircase and breathlessly explained what she had heard. The guard's expression immediately shifted from relaxed to intensely focused. He followed Maria back to Charlotte's door, and the moment he heard the crying for himself, his training kicked into high gear. This was not a drill or a routine check. This was a real emergency involving a child who was clearly in distress. Thomas pulled out his radio and called for immediate assistance while Maria continued trying to comfort Charlotte through the door. The little princess was sobbing now, her voice cracking with fear and confusion. She kept crying out that something was wrong, that she could not breathe properly, that her chest felt funny. Those words sent ice through Thomas's veins. A breathing problem in a small child was a medical emergency that required immediate intervention. Every second of delay could potentially be dangerous. The next call Thomas made was to retrieve the master key. He radioed the security office where the key should have been stored in its designated lockbox. There was a brief pause on the other end of the radio, followed by words that Thomas had never expected to hear in his entire career. The key was not in the lockbox. Somehow, impossibly, the master key to Princess Charlotte's bedroom was missing. The security officer on the other end sounded panicked as he double-checked and triple-checked. But the result was the same. The key was gone, and nobody had any idea where it was or when it had disappeared. Thomas felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He was now facing a nightmare scenario that went against everything he had been trained for. A member of the royal family was in potential medical danger behind a locked door, and he had no way to reach her. The standard protocol in such situations was clear: contact senior management, follow the chain of command, and wait for authorization before taking any drastic action. But Charlotte's crying was becoming more desperate, more frightened. She was calling for her parents over and over, her small voice filled with terror. The guard made a split-second decision that would either save a life or end his career. He looked at Maria and told her to step back. His voice was steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his system. He positioned himself in front of the door and took a deep breath. Thomas knew that what he was about to do was completely against protocol. Breaking down a door in a royal residence without proper authorization was a fireable offense at minimum. He could face criminal charges for damaging royal property. His pension could be forfeit. His reputation could be destroyed. But none of that mattered when he heard Charlotte's next cry. A desperate plea that cut through all the rules and regulations. Thomas took 3 steps back, squared his shoulders, prepared to do something that no guard had done at Kensington Palace in living memory. He was about to break down a princess's bedroom door, and he had no idea what he would find on the other side. Thomas Harrington drove his shoulder into the solid oak door with all the force he could muster. The impact sent a shockwave of pain through his arm and upper body, but the door barely budged. These were not ordinary doors. They had been installed decades ago and were built to withstand far more than one man's strength. The wood was thick and reinforced, designed for both security and privacy. Thomas took another step back and tried again, this time putting his full weight behind the hit. The door frame creaked, but held firm. Charlotte's crying had not stopped, and now there were other sounds too. A kind of wheezing that made Thomas's blood run cold. Maria stood behind him with her hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She was praying in Spanish under her breath, words tumbling out faster than conscious thought. She had cared for Charlotte since the princess was barely a year old. She had watched this little girl take her first steps, heard her speak her first words, dried countless tears after minor tumbles and scrapes. The idea that something serious might be happening to Charlotte behind that locked door was almost too much to bear. Maria wanted to help, to do something, anything. But she knew that getting through this door required strength she simply did not have. By now, other staff members had begun arriving in the corridor, drawn by the commotion. 2 more guards appeared, followed by the palace manager, a stern woman named Mrs. Patterson, who normally ran the household with iron discipline. She opened her mouth to demand an explanation for the noise and the clear violation of protocol she was witnessing. But Thomas cut her off with a sharp gesture. He quickly explained the situation, his words coming in short bursts between attempts to break down the door. Mrs. Patterson's face went from red with anger to white with fear in a matter of seconds. She immediately understood the gravity of what was happening. The palace manager pulled out her phone and made 2 rapid calls. The first was to the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, who were in another wing of the palace having breakfast with Prince George. The second was to the palace medical team, telling them to prepare for a potential pediatric emergency. Mrs. Patterson's voice was remarkably calm despite the chaos unfolding around her, a testament to years of training for crisis situations. She then turned to the 2 additional guards who had arrived and ordered them to assist Thomas in breaking down the door. All concerns about protocol and property damage were now completely forgotten. The only thing that mattered was reaching Charlotte as quickly as possible. The 3 men positioned themselves and counted down together. On 3, they simultaneously threw their combined weight against the door. The frame splintered with a loud crack that echoed through the corridor. One more hit, and the door burst inward, swinging violently on its hinges. Thomas was the first one through, stumbling slightly as the resistance he had been pushing against suddenly gave way. What he saw in Charlotte's bedroom made him freeze for just a second, before his training took over completely. The little princess was sitting up in her bed, her face flushed bright red and covered in an angry-looking rash. Her eyes were swollen and streaming with tears. Her small hands were clutching at her throat, and her breathing came in harsh, labored gasps. The pink bunny lay forgotten on the floor beside the bed. Charlotte looked at the adults who had just burst into her room with a mixture of relief and terror. She tried to say something, to call for her mommy, but the words came out as barely a whisper followed by a frightening wheeze. Thomas crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt beside the bed. His hands were shaking as he pressed the button on his radio and called for the medical team to come immediately. He kept his voice as calm as possible, not wanting to frighten Charlotte any more than she already was. But he could not keep the urgency out completely. Maria rushed past him and gathered Charlotte into her arms, speaking soothing words in both English and Spanish, while carefully checking the child's skin and breathing. The rash covered Charlotte's face, neck, and arms. Her breathing was becoming more labored with each passing second, and there was a subtle blue tinge starting to appear around her lips. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway and gasped at the sight before her. She had seen many things in her 30 years of service to the royal family, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of a child in such obvious medical distress. She immediately began clearing people out of the room, knowing that too many bodies would only add to the chaos. She kept only Thomas and Maria, trusting them to maintain composure while they waited for medical help. The palace manager then positioned herself in the hallway to intercept the Duke and Duchess, knowing they would be arriving at any moment and would need to be briefed before entering their daughter's room. The sound of running feet announced the arrival of the palace medical team, led by Dr. Sarah Chen, who had been the family's primary physician for 5 years. She carried a large medical bag and moved with practiced efficiency. Dr. Chun took one look at Charlotte and immediately recognized what was happening. The symptoms were textbook and terrifying. The little princess was experiencing a severe allergic reaction, likely anaphylaxis, which could be fatal if not treated immediately. The doctor pulled an epinephrine auto-injector from her bag while firing questions at Maria and Thomas about what Charlotte might have been exposed to. Nobody had answers. Charlotte had eaten dinner with her family the previous evening, all food prepared by the palace kitchen staff, who kept meticulous records of every ingredient used. There had been nothing new, nothing unusual. The princess's bedding had been changed 2 days ago, using the same hypoallergenic detergent that had always been used. Her pajamas were cotton, well-worn and washed dozens of times. There was nothing in the room that should have triggered such a severe reaction. Dr. Chen filed these details away for later investigation. Knowing that the immediate priority was stabilizing her young patient, the doctor administered the epinephrine injection into Charlotte's thigh, speaking in a calm, reassuring voice the entire time. The medication would take a few minutes to work, but Dr. Chen knew from experience that those minutes would feel like hours. She placed an oxygen mask over Charlotte's face and monitored her vital signs with intense concentration. Maria continued holding the frightened child, rocking her gently and singing a soft lullaby that Charlotte had always found comforting. Thomas stood by the door, his face pale and his injured shoulder throbbing, but he refused to leave until he knew the princess was safe. Prince William and Kate Middleton burst into the room just as Dr. Chen was administering a second medication, an antihistamine, to help reduce the allergic response. Kate's face crumpled when she saw her daughter's swollen features and labored breathing. She rushed to the bed and took Charlotte from Maria's arms, holding her close while tears streamed down her face. William stood beside them, one hand on his wife's shoulder and the other gently touching his daughter's head. His expression was a mixture of fear, anger, and helplessness. As a father, his instinct was to protect his child from harm, but this was an enemy he could not fight with his hands or his will. Dr. Chen explained what was happening while continuing to monitor Charlotte's response to the medication. The epinephrine was beginning to work, and the princess's breathing was slowly becoming less labored. The blue tinge around her lips was fading. These were good signs, but the doctor knew they were not out of danger yet. Severe allergic reactions could have secondary phases, and Charlotte would need to be watched carefully for at least the next 12 hours. An ambulance had already been called and would transport them to a private hospital where Charlotte could receive more comprehensive care in a controlled environment. William turned to Thomas, who was still standing by the door, looking uncomfortable and uncertain. The prince's expression softened when he saw the guard's torn uniform and the way he was favoring his injured shoulder. William crossed the room and extended his hand. His voice was thick with emotion when he thanked Thomas for his quick thinking and his bravery. The guard tried to brush off the praise, saying he had only done what anyone would have done, but William shook his head firmly. Not everyone would have made the choice to break protocol when it mattered most. Not everyone would have trusted their instincts over the rulebook. Thomas had potentially saved his daughter's life, and William would never forget it. Kate also turned to thank Thomas, Maria, and Dr. Chen, her voice breaking as she tried to express her gratitude. Charlotte was now breathing much more easily, the oxygen and medications having done their work. The princess looked exhausted and confused, not fully understanding what had happened to her or why so many people were in her room. She clung to her mother and asked in a small, hoarse voice where her pink bunny was. Maria quickly retrieved the stuffed animal from the floor and placed it in Charlotte's arms, earning a weak but genuine smile from the little girl. The ambulance arrived within minutes, and paramedics carefully transferred Charlotte onto a small stretcher. Kate rode with her daughter while William followed in a separate car. As the emergency vehicles pulled away from Kensington Palace with their lights flashing, the staff members who had witnessed the crisis stood in stunned silence. They had all been part of something extraordinary and frightening, a moment that would likely change many of the palace's long-standing protocols. Thomas leaned against the corridor wall, suddenly feeling every bit of the adrenaline crash that was washing over him. His shoulder throbbed, his head was spinning, and his hands were still shaking. But Princess Charlotte was alive and breathing. That was all that mattered. At the hospital, Princess Charlotte was immediately taken to a private suite where a team of specialists waited to examine her. The epinephrine had done its job in stopping the immediate life-threatening symptoms, but the doctors needed to determine what had caused such a severe reaction and ensure there would be no secondary complications. Kate never left her daughter's side, holding her small hand while nurses drew blood and doctors listened to her heart and lungs. William paced the hallway outside, making phone calls to family members and trying to process the terror of the morning. Charlotte was hooked up to monitors that tracked her heart rate, blood pressure, and oxygen levels. The numbers were stabilizing nicely, much to everyone's relief. A pediatric allergist named Dr. Marcus Webb arrived to conduct a thorough examination. He was known throughout London as one of the foremost experts in childhood allergies and had treated several high-profile cases over his career. Dr. Webb asked detailed questions about Charlotte's medical history, her diet, her environment, and any recent changes to her routine? Kate answered as best she could, though her voice kept catching as the fear of what might have happened continued to wash over her in waves. The blood tests would take several hours to process, but Dr. Webb had a theory based on the severity and speed of the reaction. He asked Kate about the bedding, the pajamas, the stuffed animals, and anything else that would have been in direct contact with Charlotte's skin during the night. Kate explained that everything in Charlotte's room was carefully selected and had been used many times before without incident. The sheets were Egyptian cotton, hypoallergenic, and fragrance-free. The pajamas were organic fabric that had been washed with gentle detergent. Nothing should have triggered this kind of response. Back at Kensington Palace, a full investigation was underway. Mrs. Patterson had assembled every staff member who had any access to Charlotte's room in the past 48 hours. She questioned each person methodically, taking notes and trying to piece together if anything unusual had occurred. The housekeeping staff confirmed that they had followed standard procedures when cleaning. The laundry team verified that all items had been washed according to protocol. Nobody could identify anything out of the ordinary, and the mystery deepened with each interview. Thomas Harrington sat in the security office with an ice pack pressed to his shoulder while giving his official statement about the morning's events. Two senior palace officials were present, and their expressions were difficult to read. Thomas knew that despite the emergency circumstances, he had still technically destroyed royal property and violated several security protocols. He explained his reasoning clearly and without apology. He had heard a child in distress learn that the key was missing and made a judgment call based on the information available. He would make the same choice again if faced with similar circumstances. The investigation into the missing key was being conducted separately by the head of security, Commander James Richardson. The commander was a former military officer with decades of experience in protection services. He reviewed security footage, interviewed guards, and personally examined the lockbox where the key should have been stored. The footage showed that the key had been checked and confirmed present during the 10 p.m. rounds the previous night. Between that check and 6 a.m. when Thomas discovered it missing, only 2 guards had been on duty in that section of the palace. Both men had sterling records and no reason to take the key. Neither remembered seeing anything suspicious. Commander Richardson expanded his search, checking footage from the corridors near Charlotte's room. At approximately 2:30 a.m., the cameras showed a brief flicker, lasting less than 5 seconds. When the picture returned, everything looked normal. The commander's jaw tightened when he saw this. A camera malfunction at the exact time when the key went missing was too much of a coincidence. He called in the palace's technical security team to examine the surveillance system for signs of tampering. What they found was deeply concerning. Someone with considerable technical knowledge had installed a small device that temporarily interrupted the camera feed. This was not the work of an opportunistic thief or a curious staff member. This was a planned intrusion by someone who understood security systems. The device had been carefully removed after use, leaving only trace evidence that was discovered through detailed electronic analysis. Commander Richardson immediately elevated the incident to a potential security breach and contacted Scotland Yard's Royal Protection Division. If someone had deliberately disabled the cameras and taken the key, the implications were staggering and terrifying. While this investigation unfolded, another crucial piece of the puzzle was being discovered in Charlotte's bedroom. A junior housekeeper named Emma Thompson had been tasked with carefully documenting everything in the room as part of the investigation. Emma was known for her attention to detail and her thorough approach to her work. She photographed every surface, every object, and every piece of furniture. When she moved Charlotte's toy box to photograph behind it, she noticed something unusual on the floor. There was a small amount of fine powder scattered near where the box had been sitting. Emma carefully collected a sample using gloves and placed it in a sealed bag. The powder was immediately sent to a laboratory for analysis. The technicians worked quickly, understanding the urgency of the situation. Within 3 hours, they had preliminary results that explained everything and made the security breach even more alarming. The powder was a concentrated mixture of peanut protein and other allergens. Someone had deliberately introduced a substance into Charlotte's room that was designed to trigger a severe allergic reaction. This was not an accident or a coincidence. This was attempted harm against a member of the royal family, and specifically against a 3-year-old child. When this information reached Commander Richardson, he felt his blood run cold. The implications were almost too terrible to consider. Someone had gained access to the palace, disabled the security cameras, stolen the master key, entered Charlotte's bedroom while she slept, planted a dangerous allergen, and then escaped undetected. The level of planning and knowledge required for such an operation suggested a serious threat actor, possibly someone with insider information about palace security procedures. The commander immediately ordered enhanced security measures for all members of the Cambridge family and launched a comprehensive review of every person with palace access. At the hospital, Dr. Webb received the laboratory results from Charlotte's blood tests and the sample taken from her room. He now had complete confirmation of what had caused the reaction. Charlotte had been exposed to peanut protein, to which she had a severe allergy that her parents had not previously known about. The concentrated nature of the allergen explained why the reaction had been so severe and so rapid. Dr. Webb carefully explained to William and Kate that while the immediate danger had passed, Charlotte would need to carry an epinephrine auto-injector with her at all times from now on. The allergy was serious and potentially life-threatening upon any future exposure. Kate's face went through a range of emotions as she processed this information. Relief that they now knew what had happened was quickly replaced by anger and fear when Dr. Webb mentioned that the powder had been deliberately placed in the room. William had already been briefed by Commander Richardson about the security breach, and he had been struggling with how to tell his wife. They stepped out of Charlotte's room, leaving the princess sleeping peacefully under the watchful eyes of nurses. And William explained everything that had been discovered. Kate's legs nearly gave out, and William had to support her as the full horror of the situation sank in. Someone had tried to harm their daughter. Not accidentally, not through negligence, but through deliberate, planned action. The person had wanted Charlotte to have this reaction. The missing key meant that even if Charlotte had been in distress, help would have been delayed. If Thomas had not made the choice to break down the door, if he had followed protocol and waited for authorization, those extra minutes might have meant the difference between life and death. The realization of how close they had come to losing their daughter was almost unbearable. Kate sobbed in William's arms while he held her tightly, his own tears falling silently. Scotland Yard detectives arrived at Kensington Palace and began interviewing staff members more intensively. They cross-referenced work schedules with the timeline of the incident, checked backgrounds of everyone with access, and reviewed months of security footage looking for patterns or suspicious behavior. The investigation would take weeks and involve hundreds of hours of detective work. Every lead was pursued, every connection explored. The protection of the royal family had been compromised, and finding the person responsible became the highest priority for law enforcement. Thomas Harrington was called to meet with Commander Richardson and receive news that lifted some of the weight from his shoulders. The commander told him that not only would there be no disciplinary action for breaking down the door, but that Thomas was being commended for his quick thinking and his willingness to put a child's safety above regulations. The palace was reviewing its emergency protocols as a direct result of this incident. New procedures would be implemented to ensure that multiple backup keys were available in different secure locations, and guards would have more authority to act in emergency situations without waiting for approval from higher authorities. The meeting between Thomas and the royal couple happened 2 days after the incident. Charlotte had been released from the hospital with a clean bill of health and strict instructions about allergy management. William and Kate had requested a private meeting with the guard who had saved their daughter. When Thomas entered the room, still feeling nervous, despite the reassurances he had received, both parents immediately moved to thank him again. Kate hugged him, something that surprised Thomas so much he almost forgot to breathe. William shook his hand firmly and told him that their family owed him a debt that could never be repaid. Thomas tried to explain that he had simply done his job, but Kate shook her head. She told him that following protocol would have meant waiting for the key to be found, or for higher authorization to break down the door. Those delays, given what they now knew about the severity of Charlotte's reaction, could have been fatal. Thomas had trusted his instincts and put a child's life ahead of rules and potential consequences for his career. That took courage and compassion, and they would be forever grateful. The meeting ended with an invitation for Thomas to attend a private family dinner once things had settled down. An unprecedented honor that left the guard speechless. The investigation into who had planted the allergen in Charlotte's room continued for 6 weeks, before finally yielding results. Scotland Yard detectives worked around the clock, analyzing evidence and following leads that seemed to go nowhere. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A staff member at a security equipment supplier in London reported that someone matching a person of interest's description had purchased specialized camera-disrupting technology 3 months before the incident. When detectives followed up on this lead, they discovered a trail that led them to a former palace maintenance worker named Richard Pemberton. Pemberton had been employed at Kensington Palace for 8 years, before being dismissed 18 months earlier for repeated violations of security protocols. He had been caught in restricted areas multiple times and had shown an unhealthy interest in the private quarters of the royal family. His dismissal had been contentious, with Pemberton claiming he was being unfairly targeted and threatening legal action. The lawsuit had been dropped when palace lawyers presented overwhelming evidence of his infractions. Pemberton had left, making vague threats about making the royal family regret their decision. At the time, security officials had dismissed these as empty words from a disgruntled employee. The investigation revealed that Pemberton had maintained contact with several current palace staff members, including a junior security guard, who had unwittingly provided him with updated information about security procedures and shift schedules. This guard, a young man named David Foster, had considered Pemberton a mentor during his early days at the palace and had not realized he was being manipulated to provide sensitive information. When confronted by detectives, Foster broke down and cooperated fully, providing text messages and emails that helped establish Pemberton's planning and intent. Detectives discovered that Pemberton had carefully researched Charlotte's daily routine and had learned about areas of the palace where surveillance coverage had brief gaps. He had used his insider knowledge to plan an intrusion that he believed would be impossible to trace back to him. The peanut allergen had been obtained from a food processing facility where Pemberton briefly worked after leaving the palace. He had specifically chosen this substance because his research into the Cambridge children had revealed that Charlotte's allergy status for peanuts had never been formally tested. Though the family avoided them as a precaution, the most chilling aspect of the investigation was the discovery of Pemberton's journal, found during a search of his apartment. In detailed entries, he had written about his anger toward the royal family, his desire to cause them pain as payback for what he perceived as unfair treatment. He had specifically targeted Charlotte because he believed that harming one of the children would cause the most emotional damage to William and Kate. The journal entries showed a disturbing escalation in his thinking over the months leading up to the incident, with early entries expressing general anger and later ones detailing specific plans for revenge. Pemberton was arrested at his apartment without incident. When confronted with the evidence against him, he initially denied everything before eventually admitting to the crime. His defense attorney would later argue that Pemberton had not intended to seriously harm Charlotte, only to scare the family and make them feel unsafe in their own home. However, the concentrated nature of the allergen and the deliberate theft of the door key suggested otherwise. Prosecutors argued that Pemberton had known that the allergen could trigger a life-threatening reaction and that removing the key was intended to delay medical intervention. The case against him was overwhelming and damning. The trial of Richard Pemberton became a major news story. Though many details were kept from the public to protect Charlotte's privacy and ongoing security concerns, the prosecution presented evidence of meticulous planning, deliberate intent to harm, and a complete disregard for the life of a child. Expert witnesses testified about the severity of peanut allergies and the potential consequences of the exposure Charlotte had endured. Dr. Chen and Dr. Webb both provided testimony about Charlotte's condition when they had first treated her and how close the situation had come to being. Fatal Thomas Harrington was called as a witness and described the events of that morning in clear factual terms. He testified about hearing Charlotte's distressed cries, learning that the key was missing, and making the decision to break down the door. Defense attorneys tried to argue that Thomas's quick response had prevented any serious harm, suggesting that Pemberton's actions had not been as dangerous as prosecutors claimed. However, medical experts countered this by explaining that every second had mattered, and that without immediate intervention, Charlotte could have died before help arrived. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, before returning a guilty verdict on all charges, including attempted grievous bodily harm, burglary, and criminal damage. The judge, in delivering the sentence, spoke sternly about the severity of deliberately harming a child and the additional gravity of targeting a member of the royal family. Pemberton was sentenced to 14 years in prison, a sentence that reflected both the seriousness of his actions and the need to send a message that such crimes would not be tolerated. Kate and William were present in the courtroom for the sentencing, their faces showing a mixture of relief and lingering anger. Asterisk in the aftermath of the incident and trial, Kensington Palace underwent significant changes to its security protocols. The system of master keys was completely redesigned, with multiple backup keys stored in different secure locations and a new electronic tracking system that would immediately alert security if any key was removed without proper authorization. Additional cameras were installed to eliminate all gaps in surveillance coverage. Background checks for all staff members were enhanced, and ongoing monitoring systems were put in place to identify potential insider threats before they could act. The incident also led to changes in how medical information about the royal children was managed. Charlotte's peanut allergy was now clearly documented, and all palace kitchens maintained strict protocols to prevent cross-contamination. Staff members received training in recognizing allergic reactions and were taught how to use epinephrine auto-injectors. Similar measures were taken for all royal residences, creating a comprehensive network of safety procedures designed to protect the young members of the family. Thomas Harrington became something of a quiet hero within palace circles. Though he consistently downplayed his role in the events, he continued his work as a royal protection officer. But his relationship with the Cambridge family had fundamentally changed. He was no longer just a guard doing his job. He was someone who had proven his dedication and judgment in the most critical moment imaginable. William and Kate trusted him implicitly, and he was often specifically requested for duty when the family had important events or travel plans. The promised dinner with the Cambridge family took place 3 months after the incident. In a private dining room at Kensington Palace, it was a small gathering, just Thomas, his wife Sarah, and the Cambridge family, including both George and Charlotte. The atmosphere was warm and genuine, with none of the formal stiffness that sometimes characterized interactions between royals and staff. Charlotte, fully recovered and unaware of how close she had come to tragedy, presented Thomas with a drawing she had made showing a knight breaking down a door. The innocence of the gesture brought tears to several adult eyes around the table. During the dinner, Thomas and William talked at length about duty, responsibility, and the burden of making difficult decisions. William shared some of his own experiences as a rescue helicopter pilot, times when he had to make split-second choices that could mean the difference between life and death. The two men, from very different backgrounds and positions, found common ground in their understanding that sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules. Kate told Thomas that she would never forget what he had done for their family, and that Charlotte's life had been saved because one man chose to trust his instincts over a rulebook. Maria Rodriguez, the nanny who had first heard Charlotte's cries, also received recognition for her quick response. She was given a commendation by the palace, and a personal thank you from Kate, who knew that Maria's bond with Charlotte had been part of what made her so attuned to the fact that something was wrong. Maria continued working for the family, her dedication strengthened by the experience of seeing how quickly a normal morning could turn into a crisis. She became even more vigilant, always aware that the children in her care depended on adults being attentive and responsive to their needs. The broader royal family also learned lessons from the incident. Security procedures were reviewed across all royal residences, and staff members at every location received updated training. The incident served as a stark reminder that threats could come from unexpected sources and that even trusted systems could fail. The safety of the royal family required constant vigilance, regular review of procedures, and a willingness to adapt when weaknesses were identified. Queen Elizabeth herself requested a full briefing on the incident and the changes being implemented, showing concern for her great-granddaughter and approval for the enhanced security measures. For Charlotte, the lasting impact of the incident was primarily medical rather than psychological. She was too young to fully understand what had happened or how much danger she had been in. Her memories of that morning were fragmentary at best, consisting mainly of feeling sick and scared, and then being surrounded by caring adults who made her feel better. As she grew older, her parents would eventually tell her the full story. But for now, she was simply a happy, healthy child who happened to carry an epinephrine auto-injector in her school bag and had to be careful about what she ate. The relationship between the royal family and their protection staff had always been one of professional trust. But the incident with Charlotte added a deeper dimension to that relationship. The officers who guarded the family were not just hired security. They were people who had proven they would put the safety of their charges above their own careers, comfort, or safety. This was exemplified by Thomas Harrington, who had risked everything in a moment when it truly mattered. His example became part of the training for new royal protection officers. A real-world case study in why judgment and courage were just as important as following protocols. The story of the missing key and the brave guard who broke down a door to save a princess gradually became known within palace circles, though the full details were carefully guarded to protect both Charlotte's privacy and ongoing security measures. Those who knew the complete story carried it as a reminder of how quickly things could go wrong and how much depended on people being willing to do the right thing even when it was difficult or frightening. Thomas Harrington had faced a choice that nobody ever wants to face, and he had made the only decision his conscience would allow. Years later, when Charlotte was older and understood more about what had happened, she asked to meet with Thomas again. She wanted to thank him herself, in her own words, for saving her life. The meeting was private and emotional, with Charlotte expressing gratitude that came from a deeper understanding than she had possessed as a 3-year-old. Thomas, ever humble, told her that he had simply done what any decent person would do when a child needed help. But Charlotte shook her head and said that not everyone would have been brave enough to break the rules when breaking them was the right thing to do. The incident became a defining moment for everyone involved. For Thomas, it was a validation that his instincts and judgment were sound, even under extreme pressure. For Kate and William, it was a terrifying reminder of their children's vulnerability and the importance of the people who dedicated their lives to protecting the royal family. For the palace staff, it was a lesson in vigilance and the understanding that security required more than just following procedures. It required human judgment, quick thinking, and the courage to act when action was needed most. The missing key that had started the crisis was eventually found during the search of Pemberton's apartment, hidden in a drawer with other items he had stolen from the palace over the years. It was a tangible symbol of how one person's malicious intent had nearly resulted in tragedy. The key was never returned to service, but was instead kept as evidence and later as a reminder of the events of that September morning. It served as a physical representation of the thin line between safety and disaster, and the importance of the human element in security systems that could never be entirely foolproof. In the end, the story of Princess Charlotte's allergic reaction and the guard who broke down her door became more than just an incident in the long history of the royal family. It became a story about quick thinking, about trusting instincts, about the importance of putting human life above rules and regulations. It was a story about how one person's courage in a critical moment could make all the difference. And it was a reminder that behind all the protocols and procedures designed to keep the royal family safe, the most important factor would always be people like Thomas Harrington, who understood that some decisions cannot wait for permission and that a child's life is worth any professional risk.